Turn the captions off, let the stories play. Listen to the rhythm, let it guide the way. I don't need no drills, no boring old test. Solo and cafe and buen podcast. Little by little, the words start to stick. Hearing them daily, it's making me quick. Not thinking too hard, just going with sound. Now I'm unlocking the Spanish I found. Let it flow, let it grow.
So you might not realize it, but there is a video on my channel that gets more traffic than every other video on my channel combined.
Espanol, let it go. No pressure, just let it flow.
I'm not sure why, but for some reason it hit like the perfect algorithm match on YouTube for a bunch of people.
Music,
Me gusta,
dreaming in Spanish,
like I used to.
talking to strangers.
Estoy nervioso,
Cada mensaje,
es muy sabroso. Walking the streets and I'm catching new words, picking up slang from the things that I heard. Order.
And odds are you've probably seen it, especially if this video is coming up in your feed, then you've almost definitely probably seen it.
twist. Context is magic, I'm getting the gist. It might be hard, nunca te rindas. Building the horas todos los días. Let it flow, let it
But here's the thing, I've always felt really bad that I never really finished up with that video, or at least I never followed up with the video, because I've done some language learning projects in the meantime since that video aired. But this isn't really the best place to talk about this, so let's go somewhere a little more convenient.
Julie, yo entiendo.
So in case you're wondering, the video I'm mentioning is the one where I'm talking for about half an hour with an italki Spanish tutor. And I've always wanted to continue that Spanish language journey. In fact, I've tried to do it a few times. The truth is, I am by no means very good at studying languages. I'm really only conversational in a few. I can hold daily conversations in Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese. I know like survival level phrases in a bunch of languages. I really mean survival level, because besides asking for the bathroom or some food related stuff, it's not that much. If we equate this to like dancing, it would be like learning the Running Man and calling yourself a dancer. It doesn't really make you a dancer, it just gives you something to do on the dance floor. And it's interesting because one of the reasons I'm not very good at those languages is because I'm not very good at studying languages. In fact, most of the progress I've made with Japanese and Chinese is because I didn't study the language. I realize that sounds weird. Let me explain by talking about how I'm currently approaching the Spanish language. You know what? It's actually kind of chilly here. There's a guy like right there. I feel like I want to move somewhere else.
Turn the captions off, let the stories play. Listen to the rhythm, let it guide the way. I don't need no drills, no boring old test. Solo un café, un buen podcast.
So this time around, I decided I wasn't going to study Spanish. I was going to acquire Spanish, specifically using comprehensible input.
In the Spanish I found. Let it flow, let it grow. Listen, watch, and take it slow. One day I'll wake up and just
Now, if you've been around language learning circles for a while, you're probably already familiar with this method. It's grown in popularity over the past several years, but it's actually been around for quite a while.
in tranquilo. Eventually, yo entiendo.
So I first came across this comprehensible input method from Matt versus Japan. He used this method to get to a really high level of Japanese. It got me interested to learn more about what he did and how he did it. So comprehensible input is essentially a hypothesis of how people acquire languages, as opposed to studying languages. And this is an important distinction. The hypothesis put forward by scholars like Stephen Krashen and others is that the best way to learn language is essentially the same way you learned your original language, and that's through input, specifically comprehensible input. Meaning you can understand what's being said even if you don't understand the actual words being used. Through context and body language, you can pick up the meaning, and over time, this comprehensible input leads to acquisition to the point where you can eventually output the language in a fluent, natural manner. So I mentioned that studying is not the same as acquisition, and that's because studying is about learning the rules and the syntax of a language, whereas acquisition is about actually being able to use the language. The thing is, a lot of people focus on the output of a language, which is important, but it's not important initially, no more than a baby being able to talk is important. And a lot of people think that memorizing ways of speaking or memorizing phrases is the way to go. And while the appearance of that language might seem really nice, ultimately there's no foundational element to it. I actually have this problem with a lot of languages that I know a little bit of. I know a little bit of them and I say it well enough that people think I know way more than I really do. So the foundation isn't there. I haven't put in the hours of input necessary to understand. I can only appear like it's something I know, when in actuality, I don't really know it very well. I just know a few things that make it seem that way. I never really acquired the language. And unless my whole purpose is just to sound like a TV news reporter, but have no real substance behind what I'm saying, or be able to understand what other people are saying to me, then sure, that might be okay. But I think actually acquiring the language intrinsically inside yourself is a more useful thing to do. Here's the thing, that's not to say there's anything wrong with studying grammar. Actually, I think grammar is really interesting. But it's not as useful without the context of understanding intuitively how the language works. There's a reason we don't teach grammar until someone's like 5, 6, 7 years old, because they don't have the experience or the understanding to know the context for how those rules apply. You know, when I was a kid, my dad would take me to a parking lot to practice driving the car. I was only about 12 or 13, so I didn't have a driver's permit. Because he got me used to the feeling of driving a car, by the time I actually went to driver's ed when I was 17, I didn't have to focus on whether or not this foot does this, or what does this arm do, or how does this thing work. Those things were just kind of intrinsically part of my driving process. And instead I could focus on understanding the rules of the road, the traffic laws, pedestrian laws, things like that. So long story short, comprehensible input is basically about acquiring the use and understanding of a language through input. Mostly input that you can understand 85 to 90% of.
That 85 to 90% comprehension is important because it teaches you the language in context of a situation, which is a more natural and organic way to learn.
After all, it's called comprehensible input. There's two words there, comprehension and input. Because comprehensible means you can comprehend what's there. Input means the comprehensible stuff is being input into your brain. The focus is on both of those things, not just one or the other. You need to mostly comprehend and you need to mostly input. If you aim for the time in the language to be about 85 to 90% of both comprehensibility and input, then you're on your way. And you're using this method in the most effective way possible. And to be honest, I really only started understanding this at a deeper level since starting Dreaming Spanish.
And what is Dreaming Spanish?
That's a great question.
Let it flow, let it grow. Listen, watch, and take it slow. One day I'll wake up and just understand. No translations, no big plans. Espanol, let it go. No pressure, just let it flow. Keeping cool, keeping putting tranquilo. Eventually,
Yo entiendo.
movies and music of you dreaming in Spanish. Like I used talking to strangers. Cada mensaje.
Es muy sabroso.
Walking the streets and I'm catching new words, picking up slang from the things that I heard.
So I'm using Dreaming Spanish. What is it? Well, it's important to understand that, at least for comprehensible input, finding materials that are appropriate for an absolute beginner of a language is really hard, because a lot of the initial input stuff is made for children, and children already have a basic foundational understanding of some of the language. A lot of people recommend things like Peppa Pig or Thomas the Tank Engine because the level is so low, but for an absolute beginner it's still too high of a level. So the absolute beginner level materials is one of the hardest things to find, and that is where Pablo comes in.
Pablo is from Spain and had experience with comprehensible input and language acquisition with Japanese and Thai, and decided to create a resource for people who wanted to use it to learn Spanish. He created the website called Dreaming Spanish that has hundreds and hundreds of hours of comprehensible Spanish videos at those vital beginning levels to help someone through those initial stages with comprehensible input.
You know, he actually put together a great series of videos explaining all of this. I'll link to it below. It's in Spanish but has English subtitles. And he also did an interview with Olly Richards in English about his whole Dreaming Spanish system. So be sure and check that out too. Links below. And you know, the really nice thing about his system is that it measures exactly how much time you spend watching and inputting the language. So you can see exactly what level you're at. He actually broke down how many hours of input equals which level, and what level equals what state of your language you're at. That means you can always know exactly where you are with the language, which probably begs the question, how many hours am I at with Dreaming Spanish, or Spanish in general? Well, you see, that's kind of tricky because it actually speaks to a complete misconception I had about comprehensible input up until recently.
Step by step, I'm on my way.
See, the big misconception I had about comprehensible input before was that I thought that the level was not as important as it really is. When I was working with Norwegian and Japanese, I thought that 50% comprehensibility was probably good enough. And so I was inputting materials that were way too complex for what I was able to understand. I thought I was leveling up by doing things that are a little more difficult, but in actuality, it ended up being a lot harder and would have taken me way longer to level up. So ironically, you should probably listen to materials that are way easier for you. Paradoxically, the easier your materials, the faster you learn. And fortunately with Dreaming Spanish, there are so many absolute beginner level videos and materials that it's easy to get through that initial hump where it's hard to find that material for comprehensible input.
In Dreaming Spanish, a lot of people measure their progress based on specific levels stated on the website. Each of those levels is measured by how many hours someone studied along with various qualities that one's language has achieved during that time.
So the beginner level is 0 to 50 hours, then 50 to 150 hours, level 2, 150 to 300 is level 3, up to 1,000, level 4, and so on.
No pressure, just let it flow. Keeping cool till keeping putting tranquilo. Eventually,
Yo entiendo.
movies and music of you streaming in Spanish. Like I used talking to strangers. Cada mensaje.
Es muy sabroso.
Walking the streets and I'm
So as I mentioned before, I'm not starting Spanish from absolute zero. I had a little bit of history with Spanish before starting Dreaming Spanish. How much? Well, let's look at the specifics. For the purposes of this, I'm not counting the 2.5 months of middle school, 7th grade Spanish that I took, because I don't remember anything Mr. Castillo taught us in that class. I'm also not really counting the original Pimsleur courses I took way back in 1992, back on cassette tapes, because I've actually repeated those a couple times. I've counted that into my hours for Dreaming Spanish too. What I'm really doing is starting in 2014 with that initial summer intensive Spanish study program I did that video is from. So I spent the summer of 2014 trying to intensively study Spanish, mostly using a Benny Lewis speak from day one method. I'd memorize specific phrases and sentence patterns that I could use in a conversation. And even in 2014, I also used the first sequence of Pimsleur Spanish 1. And to be honest, Pimsleur's been very helpful. I mean, they're good at a couple things. They're good at helping you develop an accent, get some survival ability in that language really quickly. And I use them in other languages. I used them with Haitian Creole in 2009 when I went to Haiti, 2012 when I went to Israel with Hebrew. But while it's really effective at a few specific things, it's not really good for overall long-term acquisition of a language. If I was going somewhere where I only needed to know the language for that specific trip and I had no intention of learning it long-term, then I'd probably use Pimsleur as a lead-up to that trip. And then in 2023, I started another program of trying to learn Spanish intensely, this time in preparation for a trip to South America.
Turn the caffeine chops and off, let the stories play. Listen to the rhythm, let it guide the way.
So this time in 2023, before my 2 months in Ecuador, I used Pimsleur again as a lead up to that trip. And I also did some sessions with italki tutors as well. And no, I don't have any recordings of those, sorry. But honestly, I think being in Ecuador really exposed me to a lot more of the language than I probably am giving credit for, because there was a lot of contextually relevant input in that time. You know, when you're in a market and someone gestures to an orange thing and says naranja, in that context, you emotionally and intuitively understand what they're talking about. And you remember it in the context of being in that market, the person talking to you, showing you the orange thing and saying naranja. So although in my estimation of hours, I put 30 minutes a day as an average input for the time I was in Ecuador, and granted I was sitting at home in the Airbnb working most of the time, probably the hours were a little bit more than that, but I wasn't really focused on comprehensible input. So if I added comprehensible as a factor of that, then it kind of changes the hours overall. So at the beginning of 2025, just 2 months ago, when I decided, okay, this time I'm really going to focus on Spanish, I started using comprehensible input as one of my methods. I watched a bunch of TV shows and stuff in Spanish, and I started watching a lot of YouTube videos. But then in the second week of February, I found Dreaming Spanish. And February 12th, I signed up for their service. And as part of that, I went back and tried to figure out exactly how many hours overall I had spent practicing Spanish or getting Spanish input since 2014. And like I said, while I probably was a little bit conservative and the actual hours are a little bit more, I think it's pretty close to around 62 to 63 hours of overall inputs in that entire 11-year period. And I think that's pretty accurate, especially when compared to what the level should be at around 60-ish hours of input. And then since starting dreaming Spanish in February 12th, I've gotten to, now I'm at 102 hours as of today. But by the end of February, I was at 100 hours, which means that I was able to accumulate like 30 something hours in those 2 weeks. And that makes sense. I was doing a lot of input just to kind of get to that so I could say by March 1st, I was at 100 hours. And I also knew the momentum would be harder to keep up after that fact, after March 1st. So after March 1st, I just want to get one video a day. Yes, it will take a lot longer to get to the next level of 150 hours for level 3, but that's okay. It's more important for me to be consistent with this practice than to try and go hours and hours a day. So that's where I am right now. I'm at 100 hours of comprehensible input using the Dreaming Spanish approach. And now you kind of understand why I'm not really studying Spanish. I'm acquiring Spanish. I am using Spanish input at a comprehensible 85-90% level to really get it into my brain so that I can actually learn and absorb and acquire the language, not just know a bunch of rules, not just the grammar, not memorize lists of vocabulary. And again, there's not necessarily anything terribly wrong with that approach. And it worked for me for some period of time, but I realized this method is so much more organic. It's so much more intuitive. It's so much more just easier. And it's not to say that you have to be passive with it. You actually have to focus and pay attention. So instead of just doing an hour of passive listening to Spanish, I actually focus on the videos or the materials I'm looking at and try to really internalize and identify the sounds that I'm hearing. And even just in this period of time, I was listening to a more advanced video yesterday just to kind of see where my level was. And I realized I can understand more of it. It's actually more comprehensible to me than it would have been before. So that really kind of begs the question now, what do I think of dreaming Spanish now that I'm at 100 hours? Is this something I'm going to continue or keep going forward with?
Let it flow, let it grow. Listen, watch, and take it slow.
Overall, the platform has been great. The price point for the membership that gives you access to more videos is reasonable, about $8 a month, and I found the materials, especially those produced in the last year or two, to be top-notch.
Eventually, yo entiendo.
If you really worked hard at it, within a year or two, you could probably be functionally fluent in the language compared to what a normal language course would cost. And of course, Dreaming Spanish doesn't have to be my only resource. There are other videos and other materials that I'm using as well, because I find that I actually have a lot of opportunities for Spanish input. Oklahoma and California specifically have a lot of Spanish speakers, and just going outside, you hear Spanish. You probably saw my video from Mi Favorito restaurant that I went to the other day in Tulsa, and everyone there speaks Spanish. So I have a lot of opportunities for Spanish immersion and input, even if I'm not really outputting anything. And I realized I didn't really mention anything about output because output isn't really focused on as part of this process. The process of outputting or speaking in the language isn't really emphasized until you're at a specific level of the language. But I'm not going to get into that too much now. This video is already way too long as it is, so I think I'll leave that for another time. But I think it's just enough to say that outputting is really not a focus at this point in time. And my ultimate goal right now is to really just maybe head into a Spanish-speaking country end of 2025, early 2026, and see how it goes. See how it compares to my experience in Ecuador in 2023. But for the next 9 to 12 months, it's just going to be about input. And so what are my specific goals? Right now, it's just to be consistent with Dreaming Spanish every day, watch at least one video. I would like to get to 150 hours by summer. And long term, I think if I can get to 300 hours by the end of 2025, that would also be wonderful.
So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to sharing updates of my Spanish language journey as the months roll along. If you'd like to stay informed, be sure to subscribe, hit the icons below, and if you have any questions or words of support, hit me up in the comments. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.